But I am so excited for our next speaker or conversation that we're having. It's a name that, if there's any diehard Kentucky basketball fans, you'll recognize. But probably what you don't know about him are some of his very successful business pursuits after his playing days were over. So I'm just so glad, and I'm going to read his bio here. J.P. Blevins grew up in Edmonton, Kentucky. He graduated from Metcalfe County High School in 1998, and he was first-team All-State as a junior and a senior. He was a member of the University of Kentucky basketball team from 1998 to 2002, and he graduated from UK in 2002 magna cum laude. He moved to Wilmington, North Carolina in 2010 to pursue entrepreneurial endeavors. Among those endeavors was a seed round investor in Live Oak Bank and global banking software provider Encino, two unicorns which are now both publicly traded companies listed on the NASDAQ, which at their peak carried a $4 billion and $7 billion market cap. JP worked his way up through Live Oak Bank from the ground floor to be named to Live Oak's C-suite in 2017 as he was named Chief Revenue Officer. After spending 10 years in North Carolina, JP recently moved back to Kentucky 2.5 years ago and once again calls Lexington home full time. He currently splits his time between managing a trading fund that he founded called Maximus Capital, being active in other broad range private investment opportunities, and focusing on his philanthropic pursuits, which stir his heart. JP is married to Grace Blevins, and they have two sons, John Paul and Marshall. Folks, can you give a round of applause and welcome JP Blevins to the stage, please? JP, thanks for being here, brother. You got it, bud. Awesome. JP, we thanks for making time out of your busy schedule to be here. First, just let's talk about your roots to Kentucky, to Appalachia. You're from the Appalachian part of the state that probably doesn't consider themselves Appalachian, which I think is an interesting kind of place to start. So talk about being from Metcalfe County and your roots to Kentucky.
Sure. No, Colby, it's a pleasure to be here. And yeah, I grew up in Metcalfe County, Kentucky, which is like the most western county, a part of the SOAR counties if you look on a map. But yeah, grew up in a real, mom was a school teacher. Grew up in a real humble family, but we kind of grew up in a big sports family. And man, in fourth grade, my dad sent me to the University of Kentucky basketball camp, began to dream of what that might be like. So I was just a kid that kind of grew up in a very normal background, but I've always kind of had some big dreams.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit, JP, because I am not a very good basketball player, but I'm probably like a lot of kids from this state that grow up shooting hoops outside in their driveway. For me, it was Chuck Hayes and Gerald Fitch, because that's when playing days. I was a fan of yours. I just was, I was 6 or 7 at the time, so I was still a little young. But talk a little bit. I mean, how does a guy from Edmonton, from Metcalfe County, lovely place, spent a lot of time there, how do you get on just talk about, the level of dedication and hard work. How did that happen? Because it's an amazing story.
So Colby, when I, as a fourth grader, my dad sent me to camp, and I remember being up there around the players, and all I could think about was, this is what I'm going to do one day. And so I came home, and I'll never forget this. I was in the backyard, and I was talking to my mom. And my mom said something that instilled a belief in me that I think has carried with me throughout my life. And I just asked her pretty randomly, you think I could ever play at Kentucky one day? And she was like in the backyard cutting tree limbs. I remember her putting those clippers down. And she looked me in my eyes. She said, JP, if you're willing to work, and you actually believe you can make something happen, you can go chase down the things you want in your life. And it wasn't the blind assurance that if I came down to the court every night that I would play at Kentucky, but it was the belief that I could. And whether you're talking sports or business, I just think the coolest thing in the world, regardless of where you're from, that you have complete control and freedom of is you deciding what dreams you are going to dream. And for me, I just said that was going to be mine. I think the coolest thing, I think it's a gift from God that we can envision the life that we want, go out and try to turn that vision into reality. I think it's one of the coolest things in the world.
Well, staying on that topic, because I know there's some big time basketball fans here, and they probably do remember you playing. I still think, though, the coolest part of your story is we just talked about it when you had to pretty much rebuild your identity post playing days. And I think there's some corollaries there to Eastern Kentucky, right? Because, when SOAR was founded, our signature industry collapsed in the coal industry. There was a lot of folks without jobs, and that question that really drove Congressman Rogers and Governor Steve Beshear at the time to say, we got to think about and come together as communities to what comes next. Talk a little bit about this transition you made into the business world and what that looked like early on, because you were a basketball player, a good one, and then you kind of had to start from zero again, and that's really hard to do.
Yeah, so it's a great question. Growing up, your identity is kind of in sports. It was for me. That's what I had thought about. That's what I went to school to do. That was my whole life. And when you get out, it's just like the person that retires for 40 years and has their identity in something. And you kind of like look at yourself in the mirror and you're like, now what? And I had that moment. And I remember I literally at 23 took out a legal pad and just started writing my dreams and goals down again. I was like, okay. And I had some big ones and some big financial ones. And I was like, how in the world am I going to do that? And I didn't know. But all I knew, though, it was something deep down that I wanted to pursue. So I started looking. I was like, the only way to get there is to either, all right, I guess I could start a business, own a business. I don't see myself doing that at 23. I guess I could work my way up into a company and climb the ladder. And I didn't see myself doing that at 23. But I became very fascinated with investing. And I was just blown away by the fact that it doesn't have to be my idea. I can go find people that have had the genius of building businesses and go find companies that have concepts that I believe in, get equity in, and then grow net worth along with theirs, whether that's through the public equity markets or the private market. So literally at 23, I just began to read and listen to everything I could get my hands on from a financial standpoint. I didn't go to business school. I didn't grow up around entrepreneurs. But I think as a self-starter, there is something you can do when you find a passion that you love, and that's similar to how my business story got started.
Well, let's keep going with that, because that goes into that next thread, this idea of being self-taught. And when I think about your pathway, and I listened to your story on the Middle Tech podcast, and being connected to another famous Kentucky entrepreneur and Chip Mahan, and the networking aspect of how you got in there, and then eventually taking the pursuit to Wilmington. But talk a little bit about, I'm sure you've worked with some really smart people that had the credentials that weren't necessarily self-taught, but they had maybe the degree from an Ivy or whatever the case, but you stood toe-to-toe with them and still rose up to be the CRO of a $4 billion company. But can you talk about how are you able to make an impression on a guy like Chip or other people, maybe not necessarily having those same types of credentials? And I say that, right, because we work with entrepreneurs that probably have heavier obstacles to overcome at the first than other people born in other parts. But it's still possible, right? I mean, your story proves that.
Yes, no doubt. So it's a great question. I've been around the block a little bit now, and as he said, I was playing when he was like 6 or 7 years old, so I've learned a few things. One of the things I have learned, though, if you were to line 100 people up in front of me and you say, you're going to start a company tomorrow, I want you to take your pick. This guy, nothing against education, love education, big proponent, but this guy got his MBA from Harvard. This guy got his doctorate from Princeton. This guy spent 7 years in Silicon Valley. Colby, I would pick the guy or girl that I thought had the most hunger about them. And hunger isn't about education. That's about, a will. So honestly, when I moved to North Carolina to go into banking, I did not have a business degree, had never lent money, didn't have a clue. So I said, look, all I'll do is just revert back to what I know. And that is mostly what I learned in sports. It's like, okay, I will go be the first person in the office. I will go find the people that know the most and try to be a sponge. I'll smile at everybody in the office. I'll have the best attitude in the office. I'll try to make life easier for my colleagues and teammates. I'll raise my hand when there's more responsibility to take on that nobody else wants to do, and literally kind of took this I'll mop the floor mentality, but I'm also going to stand out and prove to you that I'm going to add value here. And so that's not an education thing. There's a little bit of a willpower to say, I'm going to figure this out. I remember when I moved there, Richard Branson, you guys, the famous entrepreneur, he had a quote, and he said, when a great opportunity presents itself, even if you don't know what you're doing, just say yes and figure it out. And so when I was 28, there was a guy who had a track record in Chip Mahan that I had a chance to go be a part of, even though I had no clue what I was doing and I was going to have to leave my comfort zone. But for me, it was the Branson quote of, this is a great opportunity to be aligned with a special leader growing companies. Just go figure it out.
You may not have thought of yourself as an underdog, but somebody reading that story would classify you as an underdog in a good way. I mean, I think the whole JP Blevins story is an under, and there's something, you have to have that fight and that desire as an underdog. But I'm interested in like you talking a little bit about the degree of emotional intelligence it takes. You know, you're scrapping, you're clawing, you have to work harder, you've got to do more. How did you stay even keel, or how did you take like those tough days to say like, is this still for me? Like, how did you evaluate those decisions? Like, am I on the right path? These are the goals I wrote down, but life happens, different things happen. How do I know this is still the path for me? Like, where did that come from? And talk to us a little bit about how you evaluated those decisions.
So yeah, you speak of an underdog. I mean, I think everybody loves a good underdog story. You know, one thing I did do when I left Kentucky at 28 to go to North Carolina, I said, under no circumstance, because I know you're going to be homesick, you're moving 10 hours away from everybody that you know, doing something you know nothing about, leaving the comfort zone, I know you're going to want to come home. I will not allow myself to come home unless I've been there for a year and a half. And I wanted to come home after 3 months. I wanted to come home after 6 months. But I made a promise to myself that I haven't given it a shot if I pack the bags up. So that was important, a promise I made to myself that I will stick it out for a couple years before even considering. But then it becomes contagious. I'm from a place where it's similar to Eastern Kentucky. There are incredibly smart people, street smart people, high emotional intelligence people with extremely big hearts, just like all across Appalachia. But one thing I didn't have growing up was just exposure to people that were playing the game at the level of the entrepreneur that I was going to be around. And so then what happens if you have access? That's the thing. It's exposure and access. It's not intelligence. But once I had access to people that were playing the game, you guys know what happens. It rubs off on you. And you get around big thinkers, and then you start thinking big. You get around cultures that are growing, and it's infectious. It really gets into your blood. So those are just a few things, right? I think you can take the things you have today, but I think the exposure is a big one. And if you don't, I didn't grow up around entrepreneurs. I didn't have friends that were entrepreneurs. I had to go find the right guy. But I tell people all the day, even if you don't know those people, start filling your head every day with good materials from books to biographies to podcasts. Colby, I'll tell you this. There's never been a better time in the history of the world to learn what you need to learn, to do what you need to do, because literally it's one click away with the material we can have on the internet through podcasts and through books. So it's no, you don't have control over the family you were born in. No, you don't have control over the business culture of the community that you were born into, but you absolutely have control over what you feed your mind every day. That's a habit that I would highly recommend to anybody, no matter where they're from.
Well, as we kind of on the back half of the conversation here, I'm interested in talking about your return to Lexington and to Kentucky the last 2.5 years, and kind of taking some of what you just said, but applying it to Kentucky's, and specifically Eastern Kentucky's, entrepreneurship, business, investment ecosystem and environment. Talk a little bit about kind of what you see. Obviously, you believe in the state, or you wouldn't have moved back.
No doubt.
Your time is spent on many different types of pursuits, trying to fill up people that are behind you to make that give them access to maybe some of the things that you didn't have. But what are some things that you think about as terms of making Eastern Kentucky a place where people like you want to be more involved in, right?
Yeah.
From a policy standpoint or just a general engagement, like how do we get more JP Blevinses wanting to do more in Eastern Kentucky communities?
So that's a really interesting question. So first of all, you can only spend so many years around a bunch of Dukies and Tar Heels. So like, let me say that first. I had to come back. But I will compare like the city I moved to what I find like in my hometown and across Appalachia and draw some parallels. So I moved to Wilmington, North Carolina when I was 28. Wilmington, North Carolina is a sleepy little coastal town, southernmost part of North Carolina. The textile industry was huge in the 80s and 90s, and it all got wiped out, and all those jobs went overseas. So when I moved to Wilmington, North Carolina, you had great people, but to find opportunity, you had to go to Charlotte or you had to go to Raleigh. Unless you were a doctor, a CPA, or an attorney, there was no business opportunity. But then what happened, I was a part of 2 startup companies that both became highly successful. One, Live Oak Bank, who now employs 1,200 people, publicly traded bank. One, Encino, that employs 4,000 people, and it's a worldwide software provider. And what happened, the wealth that was created stayed in Wilmington. And then what you had is the people that had helped be a part of that split out, stay in Wilmington, and then start their own businesses. So when I got there, it was a place that the best and brightest had to leave. And once these couple companies were formed and hit it, not only could you keep your best and brightest, but you were also attracting talent in. Why can't we do that in Eastern Kentucky? You do need to have, maybe it's some of the people I saw pitch on this stage that have a fire in their belly and the eye of the tiger, and then go create the business that employs 2,000 or 3,000, that people create wealth. But then they say, my hometown means enough for me, I'm keeping that wealth here. They split off and start more businesses, and then you become a hub and you create a cycle and you create energy. But I've seen it in Wilmington, North Carolina. I would love to see more of that here in Kentucky.
What was it about Wilmington for Live Oak and Encino? I mean, was it the beach? I mean, what was it? I mean, what was it that made them start there?
Yeah, honestly, it was the founder, best friend used to live in Wilmington, North Carolina, so they would vacation there. Thought it would be a great place to kind of ride out the second party life. So the beach certainly helped. But early on, when the software company was trying to attract people, it's probably similar to what maybe companies here. Wait, you're not in Atlanta, Chicago, New York, or Silicon Valley. I'm a 10X code guy. I'm not moving to Wilmington, North. But then the success of the company then spoke for itself. So it's maybe not easy early on, but then people find where there's opportunity.
But it really is those flywheels, and if I'm not mistaken, it always, you know, just the connection to the community that where those founders wanted to be. I mean, I think if I'm not wrong, again, Microsoft was founded in a lot of the same ways. I think, you know, they'd started in Albuquerque, and then Bill Gates' family, they were in the Northwest, and then Amazon followed because they wanted to steal the talent from Microsoft. And I know those are big examples, but it was like once they landed a couple of big ones, stuff started to just kind of, it got easier after you can get those first 2 to really hit.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think when I think about like what could happen that could change the culture from a policy standpoint, from a curriculum standpoint, and growing up, I knew who played at basketball, but I couldn't tell you the 10 best entrepreneurs to ever come out of Kentucky. And I think it's easy when you're from Kentucky to look at the Elon Musk and the Bill Gates of the world, and they've revolutionized the world. And like, man, that's just too far away. But you forget how many good entrepreneurs have come from Kentucky to create businesses that have made an enormous impact. There's this company called Awesome Inc. in Lexington, and one of the great things they did, they started the Kentucky Entrepreneurial Hall of Fame. And it highlights these stories, and I've had just an enormous amount of inspiration from reading them. Colby, that curriculum should be in every school in this state, certainly across Appalachia. If I was in middle school and I could read stories of people who came where I came from, not Elon Musk, but people who grew up how I grew up, from humble beginnings, from middle class. How did they do it? How much money did they have when they started it? How did they get their first account? That is fascinating to me because whatever we can do from a mentorship to give kids in Eastern Kentucky exposure to people that are bigger thinkers, I think is a great first step.
Well, you were definitely walking the walk, JP, because, I know we've known each other for a short amount of time, but you've been so quick to be involved with us and coming down to this event and recording the podcast tonight. And so we appreciate you saying that and showing it and being a great representation for the state of Kentucky and entrepreneurship and just everything that you've talked about today. So any last minute thoughts or final thoughts before we?
No, and hats off to SOAR, hats off to you, Colby. What an incredible organization. And now that I'm back, I'm learning more about the people in the state that are really trying to do good. This is an organization that I want to be a part of because I see the heart, the intent, and the need behind it. So it's my pleasure, and if I can help in any way, I'm here.
Yeah, we'll put you to work, man.
All right.
Thanks for being here. Guys, let's give it up for JP Blevins. Thanks, man. That was great. Thank you.